Does the Native American Tomahawk possess any advantages in combat against the military saber? Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So this may seem like a ridiculous question, but these two things were used in combat at the same time in America in the 19th century, throughout the 19th century in fact, and even into the 20th. And the fact is that the tomahawk of various different types, spontoon, hatchet, stone-headed, war club, and so on and so forth, was pretty much a standard hand weapon of Native Americans at the same time that the saber of various sorts was the standard hand weapon of lots of the European settlers in North America. The question comes up, are there any advantages that the tomahawk has over the saber? And that kind of sets the pattern of saying, well, okay, overall the saber is probably, we could agree, a superior hand weapon. It's got longer reach, it's got a longer edge, it's fully edged all the way along its reach, it's got a sharp point. And you know what? It does seem that Native Americans sometimes recognise that because they are pictured sometimes with swords. When they could get hold of swords, they did. And there are photographs showing them with the US cavalry saber most commonly, but this is actually a French version which the US one was based on, but it looks very similar to this. And additionally, there's even one photograph showing a Native American guy with a Japanese sword, with a katana, or a shingunto perhaps. And there's many questions as to how he came to have that. However, this was still very often the hand weapon of choice, and certainly the most commonly used by Native Americans in the 19th century. Well, in this video, I'm going to outline four reasons why I think that the tomahawk can be, in specific circumstances, a superior weapon to the military saber. And we're going to look at those in this video. But before I go on, we're going to have a really quick integration from my sponsors for this video, very kindly sponsored, and they are Raid Shadow Legends. Obviously, you know Raid Shadow Legends. It's the hugely popular turn-based fantasy combat game. And this month, Raid is celebrating becoming 3 years old. Can you believe that? That Raid's been around for 3 years already. Part of their 3-year anniversary celebration, every active player in the game will receive a Raid recap video. So my recap's absolutely accurate, and it shows that I enjoy the arena battles the most, which is absolutely true. Yeah, I've done the dungeons, but arenas are really playing other people's teams are where it's at for me. If you're an active Raid player and you've got an account where you're level 20 or above, all you need to do to see your recap video is go to the bastion down here, and down here just above the shop down there is an icon. You can click on that and watch your video. This is the absolute best time to get started playing Raid, and you can either hit the description just below here, below my video, or the QR code on screen. And you've got a huge special thanks birthday package worth $40. We're talking about 3 champions all at once. Misericord, Tiger Soul, Romero, plus 10 Magic XP brews, 10 Force XP brews, and 10 Spirit brews. That's huge! And those rewards are going to be waiting for you up here in the inbox, and that's only for new players and only for the next 30 days. But since it's Raid's 3rd birthday, the gifts keep on coming! All new and existing players can get a bunch of free birthday gifts worth over $25 US. Once you're in game, after clicking on the links, just enter promo code 3YearsRaid to get your hands on everything. Simple! It's as simple as that. Just click on that link down below or scan the QR code on screen and I'll see you in game. So now back to the main content of this video. Here are the 4 advantages that I've outlined for the tomahawk over the sword. And the very first one is the most obvious one, and I even reluctantly added it to this list, and it is simply that this is what's available. If this is what you have, then that's an advantage over this. If you don't have this, then clearly if this is widely available in number, and that's also important for another reason I'll come to next, if this is widely available, that is actually an advantage to this weapon system over this weapon system. Okay, moreover, and you could append to this, I would say it's part of the same point, familiarity. If you're familiar with using one of these, if that's the culture you've grown up with, if since you were a wee tot you have been taught how to use this weapon, then that is going to be an inherent advantage of this weapon system over this one. We could compare this with firearms. If you've grown up shooting the AK platform, then you're going to be completely familiar with the blockage processes, the loading and unloading, even the, obviously field stripping, but most of the mechanics of the AK system you'll be familiar with it. If suddenly someone hands you an AR platform rifle, you're not going to, off the bat at least, you're not going to know how to solve problems with that, how to field strip it, where to procure extra parts, or that's not so much of a problem with something like a sword or a tomahawk, although it could conceivably be. So fundamentally, if this is the weapon that is familiar to you, your culture, everything you've grown up with, then this is an inherent advantage over this weapon. Even if in principle, on paper, this weapon is superior in some ways. It's, you know, longer, gives you greater reach, has a longer edge, the ability to thrust at range and a handguard and things like this. Those are advantages, but they're only advantages you can take full advantage of once you've been familiarized with this weapon. Now, the second advantage of the tomahawk is based on the first, but I think that it's specific enough and a big enough advantage that it deserves its own point, and that is throwing. So that's right, when I looked at the primary sources for tomahawk use, which hopefully you've seen my videos where I go through a bunch of period newspapers and other accounts describing the use of the tomahawk, it is very, very clear, regardless of what type of tomahawk was being used, could even be war clubs in some cases, or stone-headed clubs, or the gunstock clubs, all different sorts, they can be thrown. Now, we also mentioned the fact that if your culture has easy access to these and multiples of these, that does potentially mean that you might have more than one. And in fact, your war party might have a whole bunch of these things, and these are missile weapons as well as hand weapons. They can be either. Now, psychologically, that actually hugely changes combat. We can talk about melee combat, single combat, skirmishing, battles. We'll come to that in a later point in the video, but the simple fact is that if this can be used as a hand weapon or thrown at any time, it actually changes a lot how that weapon's deployed. It means that half your guys could be charging in and throw these things as the other half charge into hand-to-hand combat. And that gives you a tactical flexibility and tactical options that aren't available to you with something like a sword. Now, we could say, okay, you can make a parallel therefore with the sword is often paired with a pistol or a revolver or even a carbine or a rifle, and that's true. And that's a whole different, we kind of break out into a whole tangent here. But fundamentally, if we're just talking about these as single objects, this sword, you can throw it, but this is a terrible thrown object. Straight swords, long swords in particular, can be thrown at short range, kind of like a spear or a javelin, and it's featured in several medieval treatises. Sabers, whilst you could physically throw them, are not going to be an effective throwing object, partly because they're curved, partly because they're one-handed with a hilt at the base, all sorts of reasons. But a tomahawk, however, we know that these can be thrown at quite considerable range and have a huge effect on the target if the target's an individual, but even more effective against a group of people. So a group of people hurling throwing axes at you are going to have a lot of effect in battle, more so than them throwing sabers at you. Now, the next way in which the tomahawk could be a more effective weapon in close combat than the saber is one which I think a lot of people don't necessarily think of, because by the 19th century it had become less and less relevant. But it would be relevant if we went back probably to the 18th century or even further back to the 16th and 17th century, the early kind of colonial contact between the two groups of cultures. And the simple fact is that originally Native Americans of various groups all over the Americas, in fact, often used shields. Now, I don't have a Native American shield, but I have an Asian Indian shield. So for illustrative purposes, that's what I'm going to use in this point. So the simple fact is that these sorts of weapons, one-on-one, and we could apply this to medieval maces, medieval axes, or, you know, Indian maces and Indian axes, or a Persian or whatever, are not terribly good by themselves compared to something like a sword. And something like sabers, rapiers, side swords are very effective at being used by themselves because they're very good at parrying. You've got a handguard, you've got a long steel blade. So they're really quite good weapons just by themselves. Lots of weapons like maces and axes and warhammers even are most effective, unless armour's being worn, are most effective used and coupled with a shield. Now, of course, we know that shields were being used in the Americas when Europeans first turned up. Firearms probably changed that, partly not because shields weren't effective against firearms, because they didn't need to be, they were really used in hand-to-hand combat, but more because the people fighting wanted to free up their hands to be able to use and operate and carry firearms. And it's quite difficult to carry a shield and a firearm together. Not to say that some people didn't do it. There certainly were people like Janissaries and various other people who did carry shields and firearms. But the simple fact is that, generally speaking, if you're carrying a shield, it kind of makes it difficult to carry a missile weapon, whether it's a bow or a musket. However, in close hand-to-hand combat, using these two things together, absolutely, this combo now very much enables itself to deal with someone with a long-bladed sword. And if we go back to the 16th century, for example, we could compare this with the early settlers who were using things like rapiers and backswords against Native Americans. If they were using a single sword, then absolutely the advantages conferred by the sword, which are essentially come down to reach and the length of cutting edge and the distance with which you can thrust with, so essentially reach, the reach advantage of a sword is overcome to some degree by the use of a shield, because the use of the shield enables you to cover that incoming sword attack at the same time as closing distance to launch your own attack with your shorter and in some senses more powerful weapon. So, shields massively changed the dynamic, certainly in a one-on-one fight, and I would say in melee fights as well, whereby this weapon, one-on-one on its own against the sword, is definitely at a disadvantage. However, couple it with a shield, and assuming that the sword doesn't also have a shield, if the swordsman only has a sword, this is now very much can hold its own one-on-one or indeed in battle. Now, because I've mentioned earlier centuries and earlier weapon systems, medieval, and I've mentioned 16th, 17th century when some degree of armour, breastplates and helmets were still being worn, you might at this point be thinking, Matt, isn't this also more effective against armour? And we can also mention, of course, that numerous groups within the Americas, both in middle of America, Mesoamerica, and also North America as well, did wear types of armour. And indeed, certain types of tomahawk probably would be, arguably, slightly more effective against certain types of armour than something like a military sabre of the 19th century would be. Because they're top-heavy percussive weapons. I mean, obviously the spontoon hawk is a bit like a pick or a warhammer. So, yeah, maybe. However, I kind of think overall, no, I don't think that's a major factor. So I haven't included it in my list of 4 here. However, you could make some argument that this might be more effective against armour. But certainly by the 19th century, which was really my focus for this video, armour's not really a factor anymore. Yes, some groups of Native Americans are still wearing some types of armour, but by and large, if we're going sabre versus tomahawk, I think armour's not really a factor in this particular debate. So my 4th and final advantage that I confer to the tomahawk is in battle, in close melee. In confined spaces. So we've often talked in the past about how I always explain to people how spears have an advantage over swords because of reach. Swords have an advantage over, should we say, knives because of reach. However, that gets flipped on its head by several things. One of them being a confined space, if you're inside a room or wherever, or just in a tight press of battle. Additionally, if shields or armour are used, then reach can cease to be such a big advantage anymore. However, in this particular scenario, if we're looking about 18th, 19th century fighting, so we're talking about sabers, backswords, spadroons, things like that, versus tomahawks or war clubs of various sorts. In close-in fighting, if you imagine the situation, if you've watched something like Last of the Mohicans, if you imagine a situation where gunshot or arrows have been exchanged and then close combat ensues, in many cases, something akin to a Highland charge by Native Americans might be firing off the muskets and then throwing down the muskets and charging in. In charging in, as we've mentioned, there might be throwing of tomahawks as you go in. And there might be, therefore, they'd probably use knives in close combat. But once we come into close combat, in actual fact, the reach and length of these weapons can become a disadvantage. And it has to be said, much though I love sabers, and I talk a lot on this channel about sabers, they are not great weapons for close-in essentially punching distance fighting. If you're in a heaving mass of fighting people, this is not actually a great weapon. If we were talking about medieval swords, at that point you might be half swording, you might be using your pommel and your crossguard for various things. This is not really set up for that. I mean, you could use it like that, but there's not much historical evidence they ever were used like that. There is historical evidence that the hilts were used to punch with and the pommels used to bash with. In fact, it's explicitly described in treatises. Hutton talks about it, and it's also mentioned in at least one VC citation. A Royal Navy officer used his hilt to punch a Sudanese guy in the face. So it is mentioned. However, in close-in combat, your ability to move your hand up and down the shaft of this, you can use this, bam, as a punching implement at point blank range. You can almost use it like a punch dagger, or you can swing the thing out. And what's important to mention is that in terms of impact energy, these tomahawks and any types of war clubs which are top heavy impact with an enormous lot of force. Now that does mean they're less nimble. A sword's more nimble and able to give lighter but still edged and wounding hits from further away and more quickly. However, the tomahawk in close range is more likely, especially aimed at someone's head, more likely to have an immediate effect. So its ability to change where you place your hand on the weapon, the ability that it is short and therefore it's inherently going to be better in a confined space. But the fact that it's also top heavy, and even if it's the hatchet type, is going to have a lot of penetrative power at very close range, I believe means that the one situation where the tomahawk is debatably a better weapon than a saber is in a heaving mass of melee people at very, very close range. At that kind of distance, this weapon, and indeed the knife, which can get angles to stab as we see in armoured fighting in the medieval period, the dagger or the knife in close range is more effective than the sword. Equally, I would argue that the tomahawk could be more effective than the longer bladed saber. I hope that's given you some food for thought. Happy to see your views on this. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you have some other points to add? I just listed 4 points. If I'd really dug deep, I suppose I probably could have thought of maybe a couple more, but I think these are the main ones. I think I've hit the main ones. And I think those are the 4 main advantages of the tomahawk over the saber in actual combat rather than economical or cultural or in any other way. Yeah, I'm happy to see your thoughts below. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you back on the channel really soon again. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.